This is Seven Sisters Road by Finsbury Park Tube. There used to be a pub here opposite the Rainbow Theatre called the Clarence Tavern. In 1968, it was renamed the Sir George Robey and became one of London's leading independent music venues. It hosted punk all-nighters and one of Blur's first gigs. But it closed in 2004, lay derelict for a decade, and was finally demolished in 2015. When someone now recognises the name Sir George Robey, it's usually because they remember the music venue. The man himself seems almost totally forgotten. He's a paradigm of the transience of celebrity. George Robey was born George Wade at 334 Kennington Road, a respectable three-storey house above a hardware shop. An uncle had married into the aristocracy. But by 1889, when an infant Charlie Chaplin came to live at number 287, Kennington Road had gone down in the world. George Robey told people he'd been born in more salubrious Herne Hill. He took the stage name Robey from an engineering company he'd worked for in Birmingham. In the first half of the 20th century, this slice of South London, Kennington, Stockwell, and in particular Brixton, was home to a long-forgotten army of variety turns who set off for digs up and down the country, from Brighton to Bolton, to conquer the empires, palaces, and Alhambras, or get the bird. In February 1954, George Robey, 84 years old and in a wheelchair, was knighted by the Queen Mother. Over a lifetime, he'd raised more than £2 million for charity, 500,000 during the First War alone. At his memorial service in St Paul's less than a year later, the Bishop of Stepney said, "We've lost a great English music hall artist, one of the greatest this country has known." But the Prime Minister of Mirth, Robey's most famous guise, was more than just a comedian. He did pantomime. He took on Shakespeare. Neville Cardus called Robey's Mother Goose the greatest piece of acting of what's called the Dame that I've ever seen. John Betjeman said, "No one who saw will ever forget the superb pathos and humour of George Robey's Falstaff." Indeed, he was one of those people who seemed to excel at everything. He organised charity football matches and played semi-professionally for Millwall. For years, he turned out for MCC teams, bowling right-arm medium. He made violins. Yehudi Menuhin played one at a public performance in the 1960s. And he drew pen and ink caricatures of himself. But as Swiss Tony never said, speaking about deceased entertainers is very much like writing about sex. You really had to have been there. We can see George Robey on film. In 1944, he was Falstaff to Olivier's Henry V. George Cole played the boy. But it's not the same. And he did very little television. It was said that his methods were really too slow. Rob Wilton said that George Robey wasn't very funny, although he could time a comic situation perfectly. The truth is that by the early 50s, George Robey's career had been in decline for at least 10 years. At Christmas 1938, he'd broken 3 ribs and bruised his spine, falling into the orchestra pit while playing Robinson Crusoe. Topically, Robey said that his face mask had restricted his view of the stage. One critic, though, blamed a loss of self-confidence. Some of Robey's comments in troupe concerts and interviews during the war, whilst no doubt intended to be humorous, didn't even stand the test of the 1940s, let alone the test of time. But old turns, like old soldiers, never die. In June 1951, he starred in a midnight gala performance at the Palladium in aid of the family of the recently deceased Sid Field. For the finale, it was the old songs that he performed. I stopped, I looked, I listened, and If You Were the Only Girl in the World, both from the 1916 review, The Bing Boys Are Here. Danny Kaye, also on the bill, called him a great, great artist. After a show in Sheffield, a reporter asked Robey if he'd considered retiring. "Me retire? Good gracious, I'm too old for that. I could not think of starting a new career at my age." on Desert Island Discs in September 1951, who chose Verdi's Mondo Ladro, Falstaff's rueful complaint about the wicked world. In 1953, in aid of the Games Fund, he starred as clown in a short pantomime for the Olympic variety show at the Victoria Palace. He was only too happy to oblige when the organisers asked for him to appear not in the usual garb, but in his old Prime Minister of Mirth costume. In September 1951, George Robey had performed the opening ceremony for Lansbury Lodge, part of the Lansbury estate in Poplar. He said this was one of the happiest memories of his life. The first phase of the estate formed the Festival of Britain Live Architecture exhibition, and Lansbury Lodge is described on Wikipedia, though nowhere else, as a retirement home for cricketers. But like the Sir George Robey, it's gone, replaced by a new community church and day centre. At least the name lives on. The site of the pub in Finsbury Park is now a Premier Inn. Down on Kennington Road, there's no place in vibrant Vauxhall for a blue plaque to the memory of variety. By June 1954, living at Saltdean in Sussex, George Robey was housebound. He suffered a stroke on the 20th of November and remained in a semi-coma for just over a week, dying at home on the 29th of November. His Prime Minister of Mirth costume was donated to the Museum of London's donated to the London Museum, where it was put on permanent display. I searched the Museum of London's collections online to see if I could find an image, but there's no trace of it. Before anyone asks, he was cremated at the Downs Crematorium in Brighton. I could have gone there to take a photo, but it's quite a way. And in the last words of another of London's old turns, what's the bloody point?
And I look and I listen.
Fantastic.
The sweat seemed to stand on my brow. My own darling Joe, I love you, she said. I worship you so. Well, as my name is Fred, I stopped and I looked. Well, I'll leave it to you.